If she dies, your planet won't even know why it was erased, the system said. And Ethan Cole stared at the woman on his table, trying to decide if hallucinations were a normal side effect of working 12-hour shifts in a remote lab, or if today had officially gone off the rails. She didn't look human, not exactly. Her features almost right, but just slightly too precise, too still, like something designed from memory instead of evolution, and her skin carried a faint silver undertone that caught the overhead lights in ways skin wasn't supposed to, while the air around her felt charged, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Ethan adjusted his gloves, which were already failing to decide whether they were protecting him or dissolving out of sheer confusion, and let out a quiet sigh. Okay. Not in the manual, he muttered, because there was no protocol for this. No handbook chapter titled What to Do when something not from Earth appears on your operating table and your equipment starts whispering threats about planetary consequences. The monitors flickered, their usual calm blue interfaces replaced by symbols he didn't recognize but somehow understood just enough to be uncomfortable. Vital readings that didn't match any human baseline, yet still followed a rhythm, fragile but present, like a signal trying very hard not to disappear. Ethan leaned closer, studying the subtle rise and fall of her chest, if that was even the right word, and made a decision the way he always did, quietly, and without asking permission from anyone who might have told him to stop. We're doing this, he said to no one in particular, because there was no one else here, just him, a woman who shouldn't exist, and a system that had decided his career was about to become extremely complicated. He began carefully, adapting tools that had never been meant for anything like her, watching for reactions, adjusting when something didn't respond the way it should, his mind running ahead of his hands, building patterns out of fragments, noticing small consistencies where there should have been none, and every time he thought he understood, something shifted just enough to remind him he didn't. Time stretched in that strange way it did when everything mattered at once, seconds behaving like suggestions rather than rules, and somewhere in the middle of it all, one of the monitors went completely still, as if even the technology had decided to wait and see what he would do next. Ethan exhaled slowly. No pressure, he murmured, because pressure implied choice, and this didn't feel like a choice anymore. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the reading stabilized, the erratic fluctuations smoothing into something steady, something sustainable, and the room seemed to release a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her face, waiting for some sign that he hadn't just delayed the inevitable. And that's when her eyes opened, sharp and clear and entirely focused on him, as if she had been looking for him specifically, as if she had expected him, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching into something dense and electric, until the system spoke again, softer this time, almost careful. Primary anchor detected, and Ethan blinked once. That sounds like something I should be concerned about, he said, just as her hand lifted, slow but deliberate, and closed around his wrist with surprising certainty, and the monitors flickered one more time before displaying a message he understood perfectly, even without knowing how. Separation not advised. Her grip was steady, not desperate, not weak, but deliberate, like she had already made a decision Ethan had not been invited to understand, and he glanced down at her hand around his wrist, then back at her eyes, which had not moved once, not even to blink, and he let out a slow breath. Okay, that is new, he said, because understatement had always been his preferred survival strategy. The monitors shifted again, their alien symbols reorganizing into something closer to structured meaning. And Ethan had the uncomfortable sense that the room was no longer just observing him. It was adapting to him, adjusting variables around his presence as if he had been added to an equation that was not supposed to include him. Primary anchor confirmed. The system repeated, more certain this time, and Ethan tilted his head slightly. You keep saying that like I should know what it means, he murmured, because talking to machines felt reasonable compared to whatever this was, the woman's. Fingers tightened just a fraction, enough to register, not enough to hurt, and a faint warmth spread from where she touched him. Not heat exactly, but something closer to resonance, like standing too close to a speaker and feeling the vibration in your chest before you hear the sound. Ethan stilled, his usual dry commentary pausing for a moment as he tried to categorize the sensation and failed, which was becoming a recurring theme. The air in the lab shifted subtly, the low hum of equipment changing pitch as if recalibrating around a new baseline, and one of the screens flickered to display a series of lines that resolved into plain language, clear and direct in a way that felt almost polite. Biological linkage established, separation risk elevated, survival probability interdependent. Ethan read it once, then again, just to confirm it had not improved on a second pass, and nodded slowly. That sounds inconvenient, he said, because panic required energy he preferred to conserve. Her gaze softened by a degree so small it might have been imagined, the sharp edge of assessment easing into something quieter, more focused, and for the first time he noticed the faint movement of her breathing aligning, not with the machine, but with him, the rhythm matching his without asking permission. That is not how that should work, he said under his breath, more to himself than to her, because biology did not negotiate like this. It did not rewrite itself mid-conversation, and yet here they were. The system chimed once, a sound that felt less like an alert and more like a decision being finalized. And another message appeared, slower this time, as if aware it was being read by someone who preferred clarity over drama. Subject relocation recommended. Environmental compatibility outside current planet insufficient. Ethan let out a quiet laugh that did not reach his eyes. Of course it is, he said, because apparently saving one life now came with relocation suggestions. Her hand shifted slightly on his wrist, not pulling, not forcing, just holding, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and precise, carrying an accent he could not place but understood anyway. You stabilized me, she said, each word measured, as if translation required effort. Now you are part of the system that keeps me alive, and Ethan blinked once, absorbing that, then nodded with the calm of someone who had just realized the problem was much larger than originally advertised. Right, he said, glancing at the screens, then back at her. And I am guessing this is the part where staying here is no longer an option. And the system answered before she did, its tone almost apologetic. Remaining will result in progressive failure for both subjects. And Ethan exhaled slowly, looking around the lab that had been his entire world for the past 3 years, the familiar equipment, the predictable silence, the comfort of knowing exactly how things worked, and then back at the woman who had rewritten all of that in less than an hour, and he gave a small, resigned nod. I always knew this job would get complicated, he said quietly. I just did not expect it to involve leaving the planet. So this is the part where I pretend I have a choice, Ethan said quietly, more to the room than to her. And the room, which had already demonstrated a concerning level of awareness, chose not to argue. Her hand remained around his wrist, not restraining him, not guiding him, just there, as if letting go had never been part of the design, and Ethan noticed that the faint resonance from before had stabilized into something almost comfortable, like standing in a place where gravity finally made sense after being slightly off for too long. He glanced at the monitors again, watching the data streams adjust in real time, his own biological readings now layered beside hers, synchronized in ways that should not have been possible, and he let out a soft breath. I am going to need a better explanation than relocation recommended, he said, because leaving Earth felt like something that deserved at least a footnote. She studied him for a moment, her gaze steady but no longer sharp, something quieter beneath it now, and when she spoke, her voice carried more certainty, the translation smoother. My physiology is stabilized by your presence, she said, choosing each word with precision. Your body adapted during intervention. The link is not temporary. And Ethan nodded slowly, because of course it was not temporary. Nothing about today had suggested short-term solutions. He shifted slightly, testing the space between them, and immediately felt the subtle change, not pain, not even discomfort, just a clear signal that distance was not recommended, like stepping out of range of something essential without realizing it until the absence made itself known. Right, he murmured, stepping back into place without comment. That answers that, because he had always preferred systems that gave feedback, even if the feedback was inconvenient. The lab lights dimmed briefly, not in failure, but in transition, and for the first time Ethan noticed the structure around them was not entirely his. sections of the wall subtly reconfiguring, interfaces emerging where there had only been smooth surfaces before, the environment shifting from human workspace to something else entirely, something that felt older, more intentional. "You did not land here by accident," he said, more observation than question, and her eyes flickered in acknowledgement. "No," she replied simply, "but I did not intend to rely on you." And Ethan gave a small, almost amused nod. "Story of my life," he said, because being unexpectedly necessary had never been part of his long-term planning. The system chimed again, softer now, and a new projection formed in the air, a curved structure that took him a second to recognize as a vessel, not built but grown, its design following logic he could not fully map but instinctively understood, and beneath it, a trajectory, one that started exactly where they stood and extended outward, far beyond anything he had ever considered reachable. "Departure window optimal," the system stated, its tone carrying something that felt uncomfortably like urgency wrapped in politeness, and Ethan stared at the projection, then at the room around him, the familiar details already fading into irrelevance, replaced by something that did not belong to Earth and had no intention of asking permission to stay. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You know, most jobs give you 2 weeks' notice," he said, because humor was easier than admitting that everything he knew was about to become optional. She watched him, that same focused attention, but now there was something else there, not just evaluation, not just recognition, but a quiet expectation, as if she already knew what he would choose before he did. Ethan looked back at the projection one more time, at the line that led away from everything familiar, and then down at her hand still resting lightly against his wrist, steady, certain, and he gave a small nod to himself. "Okay," he said under his breath, not to her, not to the system, but to whatever part of him had already accepted this long before he said it out loud. "Let us see how far this goes." The room did not ask for confirmation. It simply moved forward, and Ethan had the distinct impression that whatever system he had triggered had already calculated his decision several steps ahead of him. The projection expanded, the curved vessel becoming more defined, its surface shifting like liquid metal that remembered being solid, and the walls around him responded in kind, panels folding back to reveal structures that had been hidden in plain sight, as if the lab had always been something else and had only been pretending to be ordinary until now. "You really could have mentioned this earlier," Ethan said, watching as the floor beneath him adjusted by a fraction of an inch, aligning to a new center of gravity that did not quite belong to Earth anymore, and the system replied with quiet precision. Activation required biological confirmation, which sounded suspiciously like he had just been used as a key. Lyra's hand eased slightly, not letting go, but shifting into something less like restraint and more like presence. And Ethan noticed that the earlier tension had faded from her posture, replaced by a controlled stillness that suggested strength returning rather than fragility lingering. "You are recovering," he observed, because stating the obvious felt like a safe place to start, and she inclined her head just enough to acknowledge it. "Because of you," she said, not as gratitude, not as praise, but as fact, and somehow that made it land heavier. The lab, or what used to be a lab, dimmed again, and a seam appeared along the far wall, widening without sound to reveal something that was definitely not part of any facility he had ever worked in, a corridor that seemed to extend further than the building should physically allow, its surfaces smooth and reflective, but not in a way that returned his image accurately, more like it was deciding what version of him to show. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then let out a small breath. "Of course there is a hallway," he said, because every irreversible life decision apparently required a dramatic exit path. The system pulsed softly, transit path stable, and the projection shifted to align with the corridor, the trajectory no longer abstract but immediate, actionable, which was significantly more concerning. Ethan glanced back once, out of habit more than hope, at the familiar corners of the room that had defined his life for years, the equipment he knew better than most people, the quiet routine that had never asked anything extraordinary from him. And for a brief moment, the contrast settled in, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear, like a line drawn between what was known and what was not. "No one is going to believe this," he said under his breath, and Lyra's gaze followed his, then returned to him with that same steady focus. It does not matter, she replied calmly, and Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. That is a very convenient philosophy, he said, because it was easier than admitting she was probably right. The corridor seemed to wait, not impatient, not urgent, just ready, and the air carried that same faint resonance he had started to associate with her presence, now stronger, more defined, as if the environment itself recognized her authority within it. Ethan shifted his weight, testing the invisible boundary one last time, and the subtle feedback returned immediately, a reminder that staying behind was no longer compatible with staying functional, and he nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. Right, he said, straightening slightly. We are doing this because at some point the only thing left to do with an impossible situation was to walk into it. Lyra moved first, not pulling him, not guiding him, simply stepping forward with the quiet certainty of someone who had already accepted the outcome, and after half a second, Ethan followed, because hesitation felt pointless when the universe had clearly already made up its mind. The corridor did not feel like something you walked through so much as something that adjusted around you. The floor steady beneath Ethan's feet, but the sense of distance behaving in a way that made his instincts quietly give up trying to measure it. And he kept his gaze forward, not because he was particularly brave, but because looking too closely at the walls felt like an invitation for them to start explaining themselves. Lyra moved beside him with a controlled ease that suggested this environment belonged to her in a way it never could to him, her posture no longer carrying the faint strain from before, each step precise, deliberate, as if she had stepped back into a role she had only briefly been separated from. So this is yours, Ethan said, more statement than question, because the entire structure seemed to respond subtly to her presence. Light shifting by a fraction, the faint resonance in the air aligning itself with her movements, and she glanced at him, her expression calm. It responds to my command, she said, which Ethan translated internally to yes, but with more implications than he was ready to unpack. The corridor widened without warning, opening into a chamber that made his previous workspace feel like a storage closet, the space vast but not empty, filled with structures that curved upward and outward in layered arcs, each one carrying a quiet sense of purpose, as if everything here had been designed to anticipate movement before it happened. Ethan slowed slightly, not stopping, just recalibrating, his eyes tracking the subtle shifts in light and surface, the way the environment seemed to register him and then file him under a category he did not have clearance to read. I am guessing this is where I start being very out of my depth, he said, because acknowledging the obvious felt like a good baseline. And Lyra's gaze flickered toward him again, that same unreadable focus softening just enough to suggest something like awareness rather than evaluation. You were already out of your depth, she replied evenly, and Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. Fair, he said, because accuracy was difficult to argue with. The system pulsed again, its presence less intrusive now, more integrated, and a new series of projections appeared, not hovering randomly but aligning themselves in a structured formation that Ethan instinctively recognized as status indicators, pathways, options, all of them branching outward from a central point that corresponded exactly with where Lyra stood. Core systems online, the voice stated, and Ethan felt the faint shift in pressure, like a building holding itself a little straighter after waking up. He glanced at Lyra, then back at the projections, noting how none of them responded to him directly. Everything routing through her position, her authority, and he tilted his head slightly. You are not just a passenger, he said, because that had become very clear very quickly. She did not answer immediately, and for a moment the silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just deliberate, before she spoke, her voice carrying that same precise control. No, she said simply, and the system, apparently deciding context was now required, added in a tone that carried something close to deference. Command authority recognized, followed by a designation Ethan did not fully understand but felt rather than translated. He blinked once, processing that, then nodded slowly. Right, he murmured, so I accidentally saved someone important. And Lyra's eyes held his, steady, unflinching, not denying it, not confirming it in a way that would make it easier to digest, just letting the weight of it exist between them. The chamber adjusted again, a low hum building beneath the floor, not alarming, but significant, and the projection shifted from internal structures to something far larger, a view that extended beyond the vessel itself, revealing the curvature of Earth through a transparent field that had not been there a moment ago. Ethan's breath caught, not dramatically, just enough to register, because seeing the planet from this angle, from this distance, was not something he had ever planned for, and the reality of it settled in quietly. The scale, the distance, the finality implied in the positioning. That is, not a local flight, he said under his breath, and the system responded with calm efficiency. Departure sequence available, as if offering a suggestion rather than presenting an irreversible transition. Ethan stood there for a second longer than necessary, taking in the view, the familiarity of something he had always considered constant now framed as something he was about to leave behind. And then he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but steady. "Okay," he said, not to anyone in particular. "That is new." And beside him, Lyra did not look at the planet. She looked at him, as if the more important transition had nothing to do with distance at all. "If I step back right now, what happens?" Ethan asked quietly, not looking away from the curve of Earth suspended beyond the transparent field, because the question felt like something that deserved to exist before everything became irreversible, and the system answered before Lyra did, its tone calm in a way that made the words land heavier. "Separation beyond optimal range will initiate progressive destabilization." And Ethan nodded once, slow, absorbing it the way he absorbed everything else. Today, without dramatics, just a quiet adjustment of expectations. "For both of us," he clarified, because specifics mattered, and Lyra inclined her head slightly, confirming it without softening it. And for a moment the room held that silence again, not empty, not passive, but aware, as if waiting to see whether he would interpret that as a warning or a fact. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing briefly down at his hand where her presence still lingered, that faint resonance now so normalized it barely registered until he thought about it. And he let out a small breath. "Right," he said. "So staying is not staying. It is just failing slower." Because translating impossible situations into manageable language was the closest thing he had to control. The projection adjusted again, the trajectory line brightening slightly, and the system added, almost helpfully, "Departure within current window maximizes survival probability," which Ethan chose to interpret as encouragement, though it sounded suspiciously like a countdown without numbers. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes returning to the planet, the familiar blue and white now framed at a distance that felt both immediate and already gone, and he tried, briefly, to picture staying, to imagine stepping back into his old routine, the quiet lab, the predictable data, the small comfort of knowing what tomorrow looked like. But the image did not hold. It slipped, incomplete, like trying to recall a dream after waking. "You knew this would happen," he said, not accusing, not even questioning, just placing the observation where it belonged, and Lyra's gaze did not waver. "I knew the outcome," she replied, precise as always, not the moment. And Ethan gave a faint, almost amused nod. "That is somehow worse," he said, because inevitability with flexibility was a concept he had not planned to deal with today. The hum beneath the floor deepened, not louder, just more present, like a system settling into alignment, and the chamber's light shifted subtly toward the projection, as if the entire environment was orienting itself toward departure, and Ethan felt the change, not physically, but in the way the space no longer suggested staying as an option, only moving forward. He took one last look at Earth, letting the details settle in without trying to memorize them, because memorizing implied return, and return no longer seemed part of the design, and he exhaled slowly, steady, the kind of breath that marked a decision without needing to announce it. "I spent years trying to keep things stable," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Turns out stability was just a smaller version of this." And he gestured vaguely toward the projection, the ship, the impossible path extending outward. Lyra stepped closer by. A fraction, not closing distance in a way that demanded attention, just enough that the resonance between them sharpened, clearer, more defined, and her voice, when she spoke, carried something new beneath its control, not softness, not quite, but a recognition of the shift that had already happened. "You chose," she said, not as a question, not as approval, simply acknowledging the transition. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the projection, and gave a small, resigned half-smile. "I think the system chose first," he replied, because honesty felt easier than pretending otherwise, and the system, as if satisfied with that interpretation, responded with a final, measured statement. "Departure sequence ready." And this time, it did not feel like a suggestion at all. The system did not count down. It simply began, and Ethan felt it first as a shift in pressure that did not belong to gravity, a subtle reorientation that made his sense of direction hesitate for half a second before deciding to cooperate. And the projection in front of him folded inward, collapsing into a single line of light that threaded itself through the chamber like a path that had already been chosen. "Well," he said under his breath, "this is happening," because stating the obvious had become a form of grounding, and beside him, Lyra remained still, not bracing, not reacting, just present in a way that suggested this transition was less an event and more a return. The hum beneath the floor deepened into something almost inaudible, a frequency that Ethan felt more than heard, resonating through his chest in sync with the now familiar cadence that had replaced his own baseline, and he realized, with a quiet kind of clarity, that the link between them was no longer something external. It had already integrated, already rewritten whatever boundaries he used to rely on. "You are not worried," he observed, glancing at her, because her composure had not shifted once since the system announced departure, and her eyes met his with that same steady focus. "Worry implies uncertainty," she replied, and Ethan let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh if he had more energy for it. "That must be nice," he said, because uncertainty had always been his default setting. The chamber responded again, the transparent field widening until Earth filled his entire field of vision, not distant now, but immediate, detailed in a way that made it feel both closer and further away at the same time. And for a moment the scale of it pressed in on him, not overwhelming, just undeniable, the realization that everything he had known, every routine, every small, predictable piece of his life, existed down there, continuing without him, unaffected by the fact that he was about to leave it behind. He did not look away, not because he needed to memorize it, but because it felt like something that deserved acknowledgement, a quiet recognition rather than a dramatic farewell. And after a few seconds, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if agreeing with a conclusion he had reached internally long before this moment. "Do not anchor your decision to what you are leaving," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the silence without raising itself, and Ethan glanced at her, eyebrow lifting slightly. "That sounds like advice," he said, because it was the first time she had said something that was not purely informational, and her gaze did not shift. "It is observation," she corrected, and Ethan huffed softly. "Right," he said. "Same difference." Even though it was not. The light in the chamber shifted again, no longer oriented toward the planet, but inward, toward them, as if the environment had completed its transition from observation to action, and the system spoke one final time, not louder, not more urgent, but definitive in a way that left no space for interpretation. "Departure. Initiated." And the words did not echo, they settled, like a statement that had already been true before it was spoken. Ethan felt the change immediately, not a jolt, not motion in the traditional sense, but a redefinition of position, as if the concept of where he was had been adjusted without consulting him, and the view of Earth began to shift, not moving away, but receding in a way that suggested he was no longer part of its frame of reference. He exhaled slowly, steady, the kind of breath that carried acceptance rather than resistance, and glanced once more at the planet, now already smaller than it had been a moment ago, and then he looked forward, because forward was the only direction that still made sense. Beside him, Lyra remained exactly where she had been, her presence constant, the link between them now a quiet certainty rather than a question, and for the first time since all of this began, Ethan did not feel like he was reacting to something beyond his control. He felt like he was part of it, integrated into a system that had already decided he belonged. "All right," he said quietly, not to her, not to the system, but to the moment itself. Let us see what comes next. And the chamber, the ship, the entire structure around them seemed to respond, not with sound, not with motion, but with a subtle alignment that felt unmistakably like acknowledgement. Space did not stretch the way Ethan expected. It unfolded, layers revealing themselves not by distance, but by permission, and the view beyond the chamber shifted from the shrinking blue of Earth into something far less familiar, a field of light and structure that did not behave like stars so much as a network, points connected by faint threads that pulsed in quiet intervals, like a map that only made sense to those who belonged to it. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, not in confusion, but in the careful focus he used when something refused to follow known rules, and he let out a slow breath. That is not on any chart I have ever seen, he said, because understatement still felt like the safest approach. The system responded, not correcting him, but adjusting the projection, isolating segments of the network, highlighting paths that curved in ways that suggested intent rather than randomness. And a single line extended outward from their position, threading deeper into the structure, as if guiding rather than displaying. Lyra stepped forward by a fraction, and the entire projection responded instantly, shifting perspective to align with her, the highlighted path stabilizing, clarifying, and Ethan noticed that the system did not wait for her commands. It anticipated them, responding to her presence the way his own lab equipment used to respond to calibration inputs. This is where we are going, he said, again not asking, because the answer had already been given in the way. Everything moved around her, and she inclined her head slightly. Yes, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just direction. The chamber adjusted once more, the hum beneath the floor smoothing into a steady tone that felt less like motion and more like alignment, and Ethan became aware that whatever distance they were covering, it was not measured in miles or time the way he understood it. It was something else entirely, something that made the concept of travel feel almost irrelevant. He folded his arms loosely, not defensive, just settling into the realization that trying to track their movement would be like trying to count seconds in a place where time had decided to behave differently. So, he said after a moment, glancing at Lyra, how far from Earth are we right now? And she looked at him, her expression unchanged. Far enough that returning is no longer viable, she replied, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had not landed so precisely. I figured, he said, because hearing it out loud did not change the reality. It just made it official. The projection shifted again, zooming forward along the path, and for the first time Ethan saw something at the end of it, not a planet in the traditional sense, but a structure so vast it blurred the line between constructed and natural. Layers of light and form woven together into something that felt less like a destination and more like a center, a place where the network converged, where everything seemed to lead. He leaned forward slightly, studying it, the way it held its position without drifting, without orbiting anything visible, anchored in a way that suggested it did not need external reference points to exist. That is not just a city, he said quietly, because the scale of it refused to be simplified. And Lyra's gaze followed his for a brief moment before returning to him. No, she said, and there was something different in her tone now, not softer, not warmer, but carrying weight, context that had not been present before. The system pulsed once, and a designation appeared beside the structure, not translated, not simplified, but understood in the same way everything else had been since the link formed, a meaning that bypassed language and settled directly into comprehension. And Ethan exhaled slowly. Of course it is, he murmured, because at this point, discovering that his destination was something impossibly large and important felt less like a surprise and more like a pattern. The chamber grew quieter, the hum steady, the path ahead no longer abstract but immediate, and Ethan shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself in the only constant. He had left, the presence beside him that had pulled him into all of this in the first place. And for a brief moment, he glanced at Lyra again, noting the way her posture had changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else might notice, but in the subtle alignment of someone approaching something that mattered. Let me guess, he said, voice low, carrying that familiar edge of dry humor. This is where things get complicated. And Lyra met his gaze, her expression steady, her answer simple. This is where things become clear, and Ethan nodded once, because those two things had a habit of being the same. The structure did not grow larger as they approached. It resolved, details emerging not from distance but from recognition, as if the closer they came the more permission they were given to understand what they were seeing, and Ethan found himself leaning forward slightly, not out of urgency, but out of instinct, the same quiet focus he used when something mattered enough to deserve his full attention. Layers of architecture unfolded across his view, not stacked in the way buildings should be, but interwoven, light and material blending in patterns that suggested purpose far beyond simple construction, and movement within it was precise, controlled, not chaotic, like a system that had never needed to improvise. That is not a destination, he said quietly, more to himself than to Lyra. That is everything, because the scale of it refused to fit into any category he understood. And for a moment, the only response was the steady hum beneath his feet, the ship aligning itself with something deeper than coordinates. Lyra stepped forward, and the entire chamber adjusted instantly, the projection shifting to center on her position, pathways within the structure illuminating in response, opening not outward but inward, as if acknowledging her arrival rather than guiding it. And Ethan felt the subtle change in the air again, that resonance sharpening, becoming more defined, like a signal locking into clarity after static. You said this would become clear, he said, glancing at her, because clarity usually implied answers, and he was starting to suspect the answers were not going to be small. She met his gaze, steady as always, but there was something else there now, something that had been held back until this moment. Not emotion exactly, but weight, context that carried significance beyond explanation. And when she spoke, her voice did not change, but the meaning did. This is where my authority originates, she said, and Ethan blinked once, processing that in the same calm, methodical way he had handled everything else, then nodded slowly. Right, he murmured. So I did not just save someone important, because the pattern had been building toward this, and now it had finally decided to introduce itself. The system responded immediately, its tone shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible but unmistakable, no longer neutral, no longer simply informative, but aligned, deferential. Primary command presence confirmed, it stated, and the structure ahead reacted, sections of it reconfiguring, pathways clearing, movement within it pausing, not out of disruption but out of acknowledgement. Ethan watched it happen, the scale of the response, the way an entire system adjusted to her without hesitation, without delay, and he let out a quiet breath. That is a lot of people paying attention, he said, because understatement was still the only tool he trusted completely. Lyra did not look at the structure. She looked at him, and for the first time since all of this began, her composure shifted by a fraction, not weakening, not softening in a way that reduced her presence, but narrowing, focusing, as if the entire scope of what she was had chosen a single point to settle on. They are not observing you, she said, her voice steady. They are recognizing you. And Ethan stilled, not dramatically, just enough for the words to register fully, because recognition implied something very different from observation, something far less optional. The system pulsed again, and a final designation appeared, not translated, not explained, but understood with a clarity that bypassed logic, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but grounded. I was trying to keep someone alive, he said, almost to himself. I did not realize that came with jurisdiction. And Lyra stepped closer by a fraction, that same resonance between them settling into something stable, undeniable, and when she spoke again, the words were simple, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. You are not here because you followed me, she said, her gaze holding his without wavering. You are here because you cannot be anywhere else. And for the first time since he left Earth, Ethan did not feel like he was reacting to something beyond his control. He felt like he had arrived exactly where he was supposed to be, even if he had never planned for it. And the structure ahead, vast and silent and impossibly alive, seemed to agree.